The early morning mist clung to the gates of Windsor Castle as Private Daniel Hayes adjusted his red tunic and prepared for what he expected to be another routine day of ceremonial duty. At 25 years old, Daniel had been serving as one of the Queen's Guard for 3 years, a role that demanded absolute discipline, unwavering focus, and the ability to remain completely motionless regardless of what unfolded around him. His position at the castle's main entrance made him one of the most photographed soldiers in the British Army. Though he had learned to tune out the constant attention from tourists and visitors, Daniel came from a small town in Wales where his grandfather had served in the same regiment decades earlier. Growing up, he had heard countless stories about the honor and responsibility that came with wearing the iconic red uniform and bearskin hat. His grandfather, Thomas Hayes, had instilled in him a deep respect for military tradition and the understanding that being a Queen's Guard meant representing not just the monarchy, but the finest traditions of British military service. The role required more than just physical fitness and military training. It demanded a special type of mental fortitude that few possessed. The training to become a Queen's Guard was grueling and comprehensive. Daniel had spent months learning to stand perfectly still for hours, to ignore distractions no matter how elaborate or persistent, and to maintain his composure in all weather conditions and circumstances. He had practiced dealing with everything, from curious children to drunk tourists, from peaceful protesters to overly enthusiastic visitors trying to get reactions for their photographs. Through it all, he had developed an almost zen-like ability to remain present and alert while appearing completely detached from his surroundings. On this particular Friday morning in late spring, Windsor Castle was preparing for an influx of visitors. The weather was perfect for tourism, with clear skies and comfortable temperatures that would draw larger crowds than usual. Daniel's commanding officer, Captain Morrison, had briefed the guards about expecting higher visitor numbers and reminded them to maintain exemplary standards throughout the day. The castle's tourism department had also mentioned increased social media activity around the guards. Well, this was nothing new in the digital age. What Daniel didn't know was that among the day's visitors would be Jake Thompson, university student from London who had built a modest following on TikTok through increasingly outrageous pranks and stunts. Jake had started his social media journey 2 years earlier with harmless comedy videos. But as his follower count grew, so did his willingness to push boundaries for content. His recent videos had garnered millions of views by featuring elaborate pranks on unsuspecting members of the public, and he was constantly searching for new ways to create viral content. Jake's approach to social media fame was calculated and methodical. He studied trending topics, analyzed successful prank videos from other creators, and planned his stunts carefully to maximize their potential for virality. His followers expected increasingly bold content, and the pressure to deliver had led him to target more prominent figures and locations. The Queen's Guard represented the perfect combination of recognizable imagery, strict protocol that could be exploited for comedy, and a captive audience that couldn't respond or escape. The idea for his latest video had come to Jake after watching compilation videos of tourists trying unsuccessfully to make guards react. He had noticed that most attempts were amateur and predictable, lacking the sophisticated planning that could create truly memorable content. Jake believed that with proper preparation and execution, he could create a prank that would not only go viral, but establish him as one of the premier content creators in the prank space. He had spent weeks researching the guards' protocols and planning an approach that would be both shocking and shareable. Jake's preparation for the Windsor Castle visit had been extensive. He had studied videos of previous prank attempts, researched the legal boundaries of what he could do on public property, and even practiced his routine with friends to perfect the timing and delivery. He had prepared multiple backup plans and brought professional quality, recording equipment to ensure the best possible footage. His goal was not just to get a reaction from the guard, but to create a narrative arc that would keep viewers engaged. Throughout the entire video, the morning of his planned prank, Jake arrived at Windsor Castle with his girlfriend Emma, who would serve as his camera operator, and his best friend Marcus would help execute the more elaborate elements of the stunt. They had coordinated their arrival to coincide with peak tourist hours when the largest crowds would be present to witness and potentially participate in the spectacle. Jake had also timed their visit to align with social media peak usage times to maximize immediate engagement when he posted the content. Daniel, meanwhile, took his position at the main entrance with the same methodical preparation he brought to every shift. He had no way of knowing that his quiet Friday morning was about to become one of the most challenging tests of his professional discipline and personal character. His training had prepared him for many situations, but the sophisticated psychological manipulation that Jake had planned would push the boundaries of what any guard had previously faced. The castle grounds were already filling with visitors as Daniel assumed his post. Families with cameras, tour groups with their guides, and individual tourists exploring the historic location created the typical backdrop for his duty. Among them, Jake and his crew positioned themselves strategically, reviewing their plan one final time before launching what they believed would be their breakthrough viral moment. The stage was set for a confrontation between someone seeking internet fame at any cost and a soldier dedicated to upholding traditions that had endured for centuries. Neither Daniel nor Jake fully understood how their encounter would unfold. But the collision between modern social media, culture, and ancient military tradition was about to create a moment that would challenge both their assumptions about respect, dignity, and the true meaning of strength in the face of adversity. Jake Thompson spent the first hour at Windsor Castle, observing Daniel's routine and studying the patterns of tourist behavior around the guard post. He noticed how families would approach cautiously to take photographs, how children would stare in wonder at Daniel's perfect stillness, and how most adults maintained a respectful distance while capturing their memories. This preliminary reconnaissance was crucial to Jake's strategy, as he needed to understand the normal rhythm of interactions before disrupting it with his planned spectacle. Emma, Jake's girlfriend and designated camera operator, positioned herself at multiple angles to capture establishing shots of the scene. She had experience filming Jake's previous pranks and understood the importance of documenting not just the main action, but also crowd reactions and environmental context that would enhance the final video's impact. Her role was crucial because the success of the prank depended as much on the quality of the footage as on the execution of the stunt itself. Marcus, Jake's best friend since childhood, had initially been reluctant to participate in this particular prank. Unlike Jake's previous targets, who were typically random strangers or willing participants, the Queen's Guard represented a level of institutional respect that made Marcus uncomfortable. However, Jake had convinced him that their approach would be clever rather than cruel, designed to showcase the Guard's impressive discipline rather than truly embarrass or harm anyone. Daniel, meanwhile, had settled into the meditative state that allowed him to maintain his post for extended periods. His training had taught him to remain aware of his surroundings while filtering out irrelevant stimuli. He noticed the young man with the camera equipment, who had been lingering near his position longer than typical tourists, but such behavior wasn't unprecedented. Social media had brought many aspiring content creators to photograph and film the guards, and most were harmless, if somewhat persistent. Jake's initial approach was deceptively subtle. He began by positioning himself within Daniel's peripheral vision and making exaggerated gestures designed to test the guard's focus. He waved enthusiastically, jumped up and down, and performed silly dances, all while Emma captured the action. From multiple angles, behavior appeared similar to many other tourist attempts to get reactions. But Jake was actually gathering intelligence about Daniel's specific patterns of ignoring distractions. The first phase of Jake's plan involved gradually escalating the absurdity of his actions to establish a baseline for how much the guard could ignore. He pulled out increasingly ridiculous props from his backpack: oversized sunglasses, fake mustache, a rubber chicken, and even a small inflatable unicorn. Each prop was deployed with theatrical flair designed to be both visually striking and shareable on social media. Other tourists began to notice and gather around, some laughing at Jake's antics and others recording their own videos of the impromptu entertainment. Daniel recognized the pattern of escalating behavior and mentally prepared himself for whatever might come next. His experience had taught him that tourists who started with simple attempts to get reactions often progressed to more elaborate schemes when their initial efforts failed. However, Something about this particular individual's approach suggested more sophisticated planning than the typical spontaneous tourist prank. The presence of multiple cameras and the calculated nature of the escalation indicated this was a premeditated attempt at creating content. Jake's second phase involved attempting to engage Daniel in mock conversations, speaking loudly enough for the cameras to capture every word while appearing to have genuine discussions with the motionless guard, asked elaborate questions about the weather, commented on current events, and even began telling jokes as if Daniel were an active participant in the conversation. The performance was designed to create the illusion of interaction. While highlighting the guard's unwavering commitment to silence, the growing crowd of tourists began to divide into two camps: those who were entertained by Jake's creativity and those who felt uncomfortable with his persistent targeting of someone who couldn't respond or escape.
Yes.
Several families with children moved away from the area, while young adults with their own phones began filming both Jake's performance and the guard's impressive composure. The dynamic created a complex social environment where entertainment and respect were in constant tension. Emma continued documenting the scene, focusing not just on Jake's antics, but also on Daniel's remarkable stillness in the face of increasingly elaborate provocations. Even she, who had witnessed many of Jake's pranks, found herself impressed by the guard's ability to maintain perfect composure despite the circus developing around him. Her footage captured the subtle signs of Daniel's humanity, the barely perceptible breathing and the slight tension around his eyes that indicated awareness and self-control rather than ballastness. Marcus, watching from his position nearby, began to feel increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the prank. While Jake's actions weren't technically crossing any legal boundaries, the sustained nature of the attention and the guard's inability to respond or remove himself from the situation created an ethical gray area that troubled Marcus's conscience. He had agreed to participate in what he thought would be a brief, harmless interaction, but the elaborate production unfolding suggested something more significant and potentially problematic. Jake, encouraged by the growing audience and the quality of footage Emma was capturing, prepared to launch the third phase of his plan, which would involve the most audacious and potentially viral elements of his scheme. He had saved his most outrageous props and behaviors for this climactic moment, confident that the combination of spectacle and the guard's stoic response would create the perfect viral content that would establish his reputation as a premier prank creator. Daniel, sensing the shift in energy around him, drew upon his deepest reserves of professional discipline. His training had prepared him for many challenges, but the sustained psychological pressure of being the center of an elaborate social media production while maintaining absolute stillness and silence was testing his limits in ways he had never previously experienced. The next phase of this encounter would determine whether his years of preparation would be sufficient to maintain his dignity and professionalism in the face of escalating provocation. Jake's third phase began with the deployment of his most elaborate prop, a professional-grade Bluetooth speaker disguised to look like an innocent tourist accessory. He'd spent considerable time selecting audio clips specifically designed to trigger automatic responses in military-trained individuals. The playlist included everything from realistic emergency sirens to military command calls, each chosen for their potential to bypass conscious thought and activate deep-seated training responses that might cause Daniel to break protocol. The first audio test was subtle, the distant sound of a baby crying, designed to trigger natural human protective instincts. Daniel's training immediately recognized the manipulation attempt, but the sound was emotionally challenging nonetheless. His peripheral vision caught Jake adjusting the hidden speaker, confirming his suspicion that the sounds were artificially generated rather than representing genuine emergencies requiring his attention. This awareness helped him maintain his capturing extreme close-up footage of Daniel's face as Jake escalated the audio provocations. She zoomed in on his eyes, searching for any micro-expressions or involuntary responses that might indicate the effectiveness of their strategy. Her footage revealed the subtle signs of immense self-control, the steady rhythm of his breathing, despite obvious stress, the unwavering focus of his gaze despite elaborate distractions, and the perfect stillness of his posture despite prolonged physical and mental pressure. The crowd around them had grown significantly, with some tourists becoming uncomfortable enough to approach castle security staff about the sustained harassment of the guard. However, Jake had carefully researched the legal boundaries of his actions, ensuring that everything he did remained within the technical limits of lawful behavior on public property. His pranks walked the fine line between creative content and harassment, designed to maximize viral potential while avoiding legal consequences. Jake's next audio selection was more aggressive. Realistic sounds of car accidents, emergency vehicle sirens, and even simulated gunshots played at low enough volumes to avoid general panic, but loud enough to potentially trigger Daniel's protective instincts. Each sound was carefully calibrated to test different aspects of military training while providing dramatic audio for the final video. Jake narrated his actions for the camera, explaining his strategy to his future viewers while treating Daniel like an unwilling, operatory subject. Daniel felt his heart rate increase as the simulated emergency sounds activated natural stress, responses that his training worked to suppress. The realistic nature of the audio clips meant that part of his mind had to constantly evaluate whether genuine emergencies were occurring while another part maintained ceremonial protocols. This divided attention created mental fatigue that compounded the physical strain of standing perfectly still under such circumstances. Marcus watched with growing unease as Jake's prank evolved from harmless entertainment into something that felt genuinely cruel. The guard's inability to respond or escape the situation, combined with Jake's increasingly aggressive tactics, created a power imbalance that made Marcus deeply uncomfortable. He began to question not only this specific prank, but also his friend's overall approach to content creation and the ethics of treating real people as unwilling participants in viral entertainment. Several tourists began expressing vocal disapproval of Jake's actions, with some actively recording their own videos criticizing his behavior rather than supporting it. An elderly gentleman approached Jake directly, suggesting that his actions were disrespectful to someone serving his country. But Jake dismissed the criticism as outdated thinking that failed to appreciate modern entertainment culture. The confrontation itself became additional content for Emma's cameras. Adding another layer of drama to the unfolding spectacle, Jake's confidence in his approach began to waver slightly as he noticed the mixed reactions from his audience. While some young people were clearly entertained and engaged, others seemed disturbed by the sustained nature of his targeting of someone who couldn't defend himself or remove himself from the situation. The ethical ambiguity of his actions hadn't occurred to him during the planning phase, but the real-world execution revealed complexities he hadn't anticipated. Daniel, meanwhile, drew upon meditation techniques he had learned during his guard training to manage the stress of the ongoing psychological assault. He focused on his breathing, on his connection to the ground beneath his feet, on the larger purpose his service represented. The techniques helped him maintain physical stillness, but the mental effort required was enormous and potentially unsustainable if the harassment continued indefinitely. The situation attracted the attention of palace security personnel who began monitoring the scene from discreet distances while evaluating whether intervention was necessary. Their challenge was balancing public access rights with protection of the guards from harassment, a delicate equation that required careful judgment to avoid either restricting legitimate tourist activities or allowing genuine abuse to continue unchecked. Jake's final audio gambit involved playing recordings of military funeral ceremonies, complete with the sound of bagpipes and ceremonial gunfire. He had researched Daniel's military background and knew that such sounds would carry emotional weight beyond simple training responses. The choice revealed the calculated cruelty underlying his supposedly harmless entertainment as he deliberately targeted elements likely to cause genuine emotional distress rather than simple physical reactions. The funeral sounds had an immediate and visible impact on Daniel, whose composure showed the first signs of real strain. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his breathing pattern shifted slightly as the audio triggered memories of fallen comrades and solemn military ceremonies he had attended throughout his service. The emotional manipulation represented a crossing of boundaries that transformed Jake's prank from questionable entertainment into something approaching psychological torture. Emma, watching through her camera lens, began to feel uncomfortable with her role in documenting what was clearly causing the guard genuine distress. The footage she was capturing showed a human being under extreme psychological pressure, and she started to question whether the pursuit of viral content justified such treatment of another person. Her internal conflict would soon force her to make a choice between loyalty to Jake and basic human decency. The emotional weight of the funeral sounds proved to be Jake's tactical error. As the haunting notes of bagpipes filled the air around Daniel's post, something unexpected happened among the gathered crowd. The tourists who had been treating the scene as entertainment suddenly understood they were witnessing something far more serious than a harmless prank. The sacred nature of military funeral ceremonies, even when artificially reproduced, carried a gravity that transformed the atmosphere from amusement to discomfort. An older woman in the crowd, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, stepped forward with obvious anger. Her late husband had served in the Royal Navy, and she immediately recognized the cruel manipulation Jake was employing. "Young man," she called out in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "that is absolutely disgraceful. You should be ashamed of yourself for treating a soldier this way." Her intervention marked the first direct public confrontation of Jake's actions, and her words carried moral weight that resonated with other visitors. Emma found herself torn between continuing to film and stepping away from what felt increasingly wrong. Through her camera lens, she could see the subtle but unmistakable signs that Daniel was being genuinely affected by the funeral music. His military training was holding, but she could recognize the emotional cost of maintaining composure while being subjected to such pointed psychological manipulation. Her role as documenter was becoming complicity in something that felt more like cruelty than entertainment. Jake, sensing the shift in crowd sentiment, but committed to his content strategy, decided to escalate further rather than retreat. He pulled out his final prop, a realistic replica of a military casualty notification letter, which he began reading aloud in a mock-serious voice. The prop was designed to trigger the deepest emotional responses in military personnel, exploiting their natural fear of losing comrades and their trained sensitivity to casualty notifications. The choice revealed the calculated malice underlying his supposedly creative content. Daniel felt his composure reach its breaking point as Jake's voice carried the familiar formal language of military casualty notifications. Every soldier's worst. Fear was receiving such notification about fallen friends, and hearing the sacred words perverted for entertainment struck him at his emotional core. His hands, hidden beneath his ceremonial gloves, formed involuntary fists as his body responded to the psychological assault with barely contained anger and distress. Captain Morrison, who had been monitoring the situation from his office through security cameras, immediately dispatched plainclothes security officers to assess the scene. The captain's experience told him that what was unfolding had crossed the line from tourist enthusiasm into harassment that threatened both his soldiers' well-being and the dignity of the ceremonial position. His primary concern was protecting Daniel, while maintaining the appropriate institutional response to what was clearly becoming a serious incident. Marcus could no longer remain passive as he watched his childhood friend cross ethical boundaries that revealed character flaws he had never recognized before. Jake's willingness to cause genuine emotional distress to a stranger for internet fame represented a moral failing that Marcus found impossible to support. He approached Jake from behind and grabbed his arm, whispering urgently, "This has gone too far. We need to stop now, before someone gets hurt or we face real consequences." Jake shrugged off Marcus's attempt at intervention, his focus entirely on the potential viral value of the content they were creating. He had invested too much time and planning into this prank to abandon it before achieving the dramatic climax he believed would guarantee millions of views. His pursuit of social media success had overcome any consideration for the human cost of his actions, revealing how completely he had prioritized digital fame over basic decency and respect. The crowd's reaction continued to turn against Jake as more people recognized the cruelty of his approach. Several tourists began recording their own videos specifically to document what they perceived as harassment rather than entertainment. Social media was beginning to work against Jake as real-time posts criticized his behavior and called for intervention. The viral moment he was trying to create was developing, but not in the way he had planned. Daniel, drawing upon reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed, managed to maintain his physical stillness even as Jake's psychological assault reached its peak intensity. However, the effort was visible to anyone who looked closely. The slight tremor in his jaw, the increased rate of his breathing, and the tension around his eyes that indicated he was approaching the limits of human endurance. His training was holding, but at enormous personal cost. Emma made her decision. She stopped recording and stepped away from her position, unable to continue participating in what had clearly become systematic harassment of someone who couldn't defend himself or escape the situation. Her withdrawal removed the primary documentation of Jake's planned climax, undermining the entire purpose of his elaborate scheme. When Jake noticed her absence, he spun around in confusion and anger. Temporarily breaking his focus on Daniel, the moment of Jake's distraction provided Daniel with a brief respite from the sustained psychological pressure, though he remained perfectly still at his post. Several members of the crowd used Jake's momentary inattention to position themselves between him and the guard, forming an impromptu human barrier that demonstrated public support for Daniel and disapproval of Jake's actions. The intervention showed how ordinary people could recognize dignity under assault and act to protect it. Palace security officers arrived at the scene in plainclothes, their trained eyes quickly assessing the situation and identifying Jake as the primary source of disruption. They positioned themselves strategically to intervene if necessary, while carefully observing the dynamics to determine the appropriate level of response. Their presence added official weight to the growing public criticism of Jake's behavior. Jake found himself increasingly isolated as his support system collapsed around him. Emma's withdrawal, Marcus's opposition, and the crowd's hostility combined to transform his planned triumph into an emerging disaster. However, his commitment to creating viral content and his inability to recognize the ethical boundaries he had crossed meant he was preparing for one final, desperate attempt to salvage his video by pushing Daniel beyond his breaking point. Jake's desperation led him to attempt his most outrageous and potentially dangerous final gambit. Realizing that his planned content was failing and facing increasing opposition from both the crowd and his own team, he made a decision that would forever change the trajectory of his social media career and his understanding of human dignity. He approached Daniel directly, positioning himself inches from the guard's face, and began shouting a stream of personal insults and provocations designed to trigger an inevitable human response. "You're pathetic," Jake screamed, his voice carrying across the courtyard and shocking even those tourists who had been passively observing the scene. "Standing here like a robot while I make a fool of you in front of thousands of people. Don't you have any self-respect, any dignity, or are you just a trained monkey performing tricks for tourists?" His words were calculated to attack Daniel's sense of personal worth and professional pride. Targeting the psychological foundations that supported his ceremonial role, Daniel felt the insults strike at his core sense of identity and purpose. Jake's words were designed to undermine everything he believed about his service and his personal worth, attacking not just his professional performance, but his fundamental humanity. The sustained assault had already pushed him to his limits, and this final verbal attack tested whether his training could overcome the natural human need to defend one's dignity and self-respect when directly challenged. The crowd's reaction to Jake's verbal assault was immediate and unified condemnation. Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward again, her voice shaking with anger as she addressed Jake directly. "You are a disgusting excuse for a human being. This young man is serving his country with honor while you're acting like a complete coward, attacking someone who can't fight back. You should be absolutely ashamed of yourself, and I hope your parents see exactly what kind of person they raised." Despite having stopped filming, couldn't remain silent in the face of Jake's escalation to personal attacks. She approached him from behind and grabbed his arm forcefully, her voice carrying a note of desperation as she tried to reach whatever humanity remained in her boyfriend. "Jake, please stop this right now. This isn't funny anymore. This isn't creative content. This is just cruel, and I can't be part of it. We're leaving now, before you do something that ruins both our lives." Marcus positioned himself between Jake and Daniel, his loyalty to his childhood friend finally overcome by his recognition that he couldn't allow the situation to continue escalating. "Jake, I'm not asking you to stop. I'm telling you to stop. Right now. This has gone way beyond anything we discussed, and I won't stand here and watch you destroy someone else's dignity for a stupid video. Either you walk away now, or I'll physically remove you myself." The palace security officers, recognizing that the situation had escalated beyond acceptable boundaries, moved from their observation positions to direct intervention. The senior officer, Sergeant Williams, approached Jake with the calm authority of someone trained to handle difficult situations without unnecessary drama. "Sir, I need you to step away from the guard immediately and accompany me to discuss your activities here today. Your behavior has crossed the line into harassment, and it needs to stop now." Jake found himself surrounded by opposition from every direction. His girlfriend, his best friend, the crowd of tourists, and now official palace security. However, his desperation to salvage his content and his inability to accept failure led him to make one final, catastrophic decision. He lunged forward toward Daniel, apparently intending to physically provoke a response that would provide the dramatic climax his video required. Daniel's military training kicked in with automatic precision as Jake moved aggressively toward him. While his ceremonial duties required stillness and silence, his primary responsibility was always security, and someone lunging toward his position represented a potential threat that overrode ceremonial protocols. With movements so smooth and controlled, they appeared effortless. Daniel sidestepped Jake's approach while maintaining perfect posture, and immediately returned to his original position. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause as Daniel's brief but flawless defensive movement demonstrated both his military competence and his continued commitment to his ceremonial role. His action had been precisely calibrated, enough to neutralize Jake's aggressive approach without unnecessary force. Executed with the professional skill that justified public trust in the guard's capabilities, and followed immediately by return to ceremonial stillness that showed his priorities remained unchanged. Jake found himself sprawled on the ground, his planned climax having backfired completely. Instead of provoking Daniel into breaking character, he had demonstrated the guards superior training and professionalism while revealing his own desperation and lack of dignity. The footage Emma had captured before stopping would show not Daniel's weakness, but Jake's increasingly unhinged behavior and the guard's impressive composure under extreme provocation. Sergeant Jadell Williams and his colleague moved in immediately to restrain Jake and prevent any further incidents. Their professional handling of the situation provided a stark contrast to Jake's chaotic behavior, demonstrating the difference between trained professionals managing a difficult situation and an amateur creating chaos for entertainment. Jake's attempts to resist or continue his provocation were quickly and efficiently neutralized. The crowd's support for Daniel was overwhelming and spontaneous. Tourists who had initially been entertained by Jake's antics now clearly recognized the guard's remarkable strength and dignity in the face of sustained harassment. Several people approached the security cordon to express their admiration for Daniel's performance and their disgust at Jake's behavior. The real-time social media posts were unanimously supportive of the guard and critical of the prankster. Captain Morrison arrived at the scene as Jake was being escorted away, his primary concern being Daniel's well-being after such an extended an intense ordeal. The captain's experienced eye could see the physical and emotional toll the incident had taken on his soldier. Despite Daniel's continued perfect posture and silent composure, the situation would require careful debriefing and support to ensure no lasting negative effects from the harassment. Emma stood apart from the scene, holding Jake's abandoned equipment and facing the reality that her relationship with someone capable of such cruelty was untenable. The incident had revealed aspects of Jake's character that she found impossible to accept or forgive. Her decision to stop filming had been the first step in a complete reevaluation of her values and her associations with people who prioritized entertainment over basic human decency. Marcus approached the security officers to provide his contact information and offer his full cooperation in any investigation or consequences that might follow. His friendship with Jake was effectively over, ended by his recognition that some lines couldn't be crossed without permanent damage to one's character and relationships. The incident had forced him to choose between loyalty to a friend and basic moral principles, and his choice had been clear. The immediate aftermath of Jake's removal from the castle grounds brought an unusual quiet to Daniel's post. The crowd that had gathered to witness the spectacle began to disperse, many stopping to offer words of support and admiration that Daniel could not acknowledge but deeply appreciated. The morning mist had long since burned away, leaving the spring air crisp and clear, as if nature itself had cleansed the atmosphere of the toxic drama that had unfolded. Captain Morrison remained beside Daniel for several minutes, his presence both protective and supportive. The captain's trained eye assessed his soldier's condition, noting the subtle signs of exhaustion that Daniel's perfect posture couldn't entirely conceal. When the formal changing of the guard occurred 30 minutes later, it came as a relief that Daniel would never openly express but profoundly felt. His replacement, Private Thompson, had been briefed on the morning's events and took his position with extra vigilance in the castle's private quarters reserved for guards. Daniel finally allowed himself to sit down and process what had occurred. The physical stillness he had maintained for hours gave way to a slight tremor in his hands as the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly left his system. Captain Morrison sat across from him, not as a commanding officer conducting a debriefing, but as one soldier supporting another who had faced an unprecedented challenge. "You handled that magnificently," Captain Morrison said quietly. "I've been commanding guards for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone maintain composure under that level of sustained psychological assault. Your grandfather would have been enormously proud of how you represented the regiment today." Daniel nodded slowly, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. "Sir, there were moments when I thought I might break. When he played those funeral sounds, when he started reading that casualty letter. It took everything I had learned, everything I believed about this uniform and what it represents, to stay standing." The captain understood completely. The guards' training prepared them for physical challenges and typical tourist interactions. But Jake's calculated psychological warfare had been something entirely different. What matters is that you did stay standing. You showed everyone watching what real strength looks like, what dignity under pressure means, and why we trust our finest soldiers with this responsibility. Meanwhile, in the castle's security office, Sergeant Williams was processing Jake's detention and the formal complaint that would follow. Jake's behavior had crossed clearly into harassment territory. The combination of witness statements, security footage, and social media documentation provided overwhelming evidence of his actions. The legal consequences would be significant. But Williams suspected the social consequences might be even more severe. Emma sat in the waiting area, having volunteered to provide a statement about the incident. Her cooperation with the investigation was complete and unequivocal. She described Jake's premeditation, his escalating tactics, and her growing discomfort with actions she now recognized as systematically cruel. The relationship that had brought her to Windsor Castle that morning was effectively over, ended by her recognition that she couldn't love someone capable of such deliberate cruelty. "I thought I knew him," she told Sergeant Williams during her statement. "We'd been together for 2 years, and I knew he could be selfish about getting content for his videos, but I never imagined he could be so calculating about hurting another person." Watching him attack that guard, someone who couldn't defend himself, showed me who he really was underneath all the charm and humor. Marcus's statement was equally damning, describing his friend's transformation from someone who created harmless comedy content into someone willing to cause genuine psychological distress for internet fame. His testimony about Jake's extensive planning and his deliberate choice of psychologically manipulative tactics would be crucial in any legal proceedings. The friendship that had survived childhood, adolescence, and the transition to adulthood couldn't survive this revelation of fundamental character flaws. Jake himself, sitting in a holding room at the local police station, was beginning to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. The viral fame he had sought was indeed materializing, but entirely in opposition to his intentions. Social media was exploding. With criticism of his behavior, with hashtags like #RespectTheGuard and #DignitOverviews trending across multiple platforms, the very audience he had tried to impress was turning against him with a ferocity that threatened to destroy not just his social media career, but his reputation permanently. The videos that did emerge from the incident, filmed by outraged tourists, and Emma's abandoned footage, told a story completely different from what Jake had planned. Instead of showcasing a clever prankster outsmarting a rigid system, they revealed a young man's descent into cruelty, while highlighting a soldier's extraordinary strength and professionalism. Daniel became the hero of the narrative, while Jake emerged as a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of social media fame pursued without ethical boundaries. News outlets picked up the story within hours, with British tabloids running headlines like "Hero Guard stands strong against cruel prankster" and "The dignity of service. How one soldier showed true British values." Television news programs featured the incident as part of broader discussions about social media culture and respect for military service. Daniel's name was kept private per military protocol, but his actions spoke louder than any personal recognition could have provided. In his small Welsh hometown, Daniel's grandfather, Thomas Hayes, watched the news coverage with tears in his eyes. Though Daniel's identity wasn't revealed publicly, Thomas knew immediately that the guard being praised for his dignity and strength was his grandson. The pride he felt was not just for Daniel's professional performance, but for the man. His grandson had become someone who could face such adversity with grace and emerge with his principles intact. The investigation into Jake's actions proceeded swiftly, with charges of harassment and disturbing the peace being formally filed. His social media accounts, rather than gaining the followers he had sought, began hemorrhaging supporters as the full extent of his calculated cruelty became apparent. Brands that had previously sponsored his content distanced themselves immediately, and his university launched its own investigation into his conduct. Emma found herself facing difficult questions about her own role in enabling Jake's behavior, both from authorities and from her own conscience. While she had ultimately made the right choice by refusing to continue filming, she struggled with guilt about her initial participation in what she now recognized as systematic harassment. Her decision to cooperate fully with the investigation was motivated partly by a desire to make amends for her complicity. Captain Morrison submitted a commendation report for Daniel's conduct during the incident, though he knew that Daniel would probably prefer the recognition to remain private. The report detailed not just Daniel's ability to maintain protocol under extreme provocation, but his demonstration of the highest ideals of military service strength, dignity, and grace under pressure that inspired rather than merely impressed those who witnessed it. 3 weeks later, Daniel returned to his regular duties with a new understanding of his role's significance. The incident had tested him in ways his training had never anticipated, but it had also shown him and the world what the ceremony and tradition he protected truly meant. He wasn't just a tourist attraction or a relic of outdated customs. He was a living symbol of values that society still needed: dignity, duty, and the strength to remain true to one's principles, even when facing deliberate assault. Jake's story ended not with viral fame, but with genuine infamy, legal consequences, and the complete destruction of the social media career he had sacrificed his humanity to build. His name became associated not with clever content, but with cruelty, serving as a warning to other aspiring influencers about the real cost of pursuing fame without boundaries. The tourists still come to Windsor Castle, and they still take photographs. With the Queen's Guard, but among them now are people who specifically come to pay their respects to the institution Daniel represents. Visitors who understand that behind the ceremony and stillness stands real human strength. Dignity that cannot be broken by those who mistake cruelty for entertainment. And traditions that endure because they represent the best of human character rather than its worst impulses. Daniel continues to stand his post, still silent, still motionless, but now carrying the knowledge that his service means something profound. To people who understand the difference between strength and weakness, between dignity and degradation, and between using one's voice to build up rather than tear down the character of others, in remaining silent, he had spoken more powerfully than any words could have conveyed.